Hello and welcome to this fireside chat of the Center on Regulation and Markets at the Brookings Institution. My name is Sanjay Patnaik and I'm the director of the center. In our series of fireside chats, we explore important topics related to modern day markets and regulations through one-on-one conversations with regulators, business executives, and academics. Today, it is a real pleasure to welcome Nick Bloom, who is the William Everly Professor of Economics at Stanford University. Welcome, Nick. I'm really glad that you could join us today.
Thanks very much for having me on.
Nick has researched working from home for nearly 20 years and has written extensively on the future of work. In this role, he has helped shape both public and corporate policy and has met with hundreds of CEOs and managers throughout his career. In addition, Nick has published many papers on firm management practices, the effect of firm organizational performance, and surveying business uncertainty. Prior to his tenure at Stanford, Nick worked at the London School of Economics and at McKinsey, and he earned his PhD in economics from the University College London. So future of work and remote work, working from home, obviously topics that have really gained a lot of prominence in the last couple of years, mainly because of the pandemic. And so what we saw during the pandemic is that practically overnight, a large part of the US population was forced to work remotely. And that was facilitated by recent advances in communication and collaboration technology, such as Zoom, as we are on today. And you mentioned that during the pandemic's peak, 42% of US workers worked from home full-time, which is a really large share of the economy. Can you give us a bit of a context? How did that compare to before the pandemic? What was the share of working from home there and remote work?
Sure. So maybe the best number is actually the share of days work from home, full paid days. So everyone works from home in the morning and the evenings, but if you think of full paid days, it affects commuting, also affects office space. So before the pandemic, it's about 5%. So it's pretty rare. These are numbers for 2019. So it goes from 5%. It then absolutely exploded to 60% in April, May 2020. Basically, anyone that could work from home was doing it. They were doing it all full time. And it's now been dropping back. It's now at about 27%. It looks like it will maybe pan out at about 25%. So the pre was 5 and the post is about 25. So that's a basically five-fold increase, which is like huge. I mean, it's almost impossible to find anything in economics that changes at such speed by, goes up 500%.
And it's really a shock to the economy, right? That happened overnight, basically. Can you tell us a little bit about when looking back in the last couple of years, when so many people had to work remotely, how has the experience been with remote work, both from the employer side and the employee side? And we see kind of like a bifurcation oftentimes when you look at the surveys and media reports. So I'm curious, with your interactions with employers and employees, what is your sense?
Sure. So there are three different kind of setups. One is fully in person. So to be clear, about 60% actually of Americans are fully in person. So think of all frontline retail, manufacturing, a lot of essential services. When I teach, I'm not doing full time, so I'm probably a bad example, but people that are teaching, nurses, etc., that's 60%. There's then another group, which is now about 30%, which is probably most of the listeners, actually. A lot of professionals, managers, my students from Stanford are hybrid. So typically they're coming to the office 3 days a week, working from home Monday, Friday. They're like the popular work from home days. Then there's a third group, which is about 15%, and they're fully remote. And initially people think, well, fully remote, that's like Airbnb and Yelp. It's like, yes, but 15% of the US labor force, that's, the US labor force, 160 million. So you're thinking of 25 million fully remote employees, maybe 500,000 at most are tech. The rest, the huge majority are call centers, HR, payments processing, payroll, etc. So the experience has been, so those three groups, oddly enough, I think hybrid are closer to the in-person. So the media often confuses fully remote with hybrid. If you think about hybrid, you've still got to live in the city and still go in 3 days a week. It's not so radically different than what we did pre-pandemic in some ways, because pre-pandemic, sure, we were going in 5 days a week, but most people are doing a bit of work in the evenings, a bit of work on the weekends, maybe. So hybrid is, is also where most of us are kind of settling out in. You still got to live near work. You basically get a couple of days at home a week. Monday, Friday would be a standard setup, or maybe Monday, Thursday, Friday. That's become really dominant. That's really popular. Most people want to go in and socialize 2-3 days a week, work with colleagues, but also get the, avoid the commute, the less stress, the quiet at home.
Well, this is super interesting. And so I think a lot of people have been talking about kind of like what the impact has been of that remote work shock, right, on the economy and economic indicators. So one question I have is when you look at some of the economic effects, for instance, on productivity or employee happiness, what does the research tell us?
Yeah, so I'll start with just on productivity. It depends radically on fully remote versus hybrid. So if you look at fully remote, the evidence is that's kind of problematic in terms of mentoring, in terms of innovation, and in terms of building culture. So, for example, there's a nice paper in innovation. There's a paper in Nature. There's another in Nature Human Behavior showing it's harder to be creative. They run some experiments fully remote. It's not like impossible. So there are lots of successful fully remote firms. So that looks like it probably reduces productivity if you're fully remote. You may then say, why does any company do fully remote? The reason is there are also some big upsides. And the most obvious one is you save on office space, which is about 20% of payroll costs, and you can hire globally. So I've talked to a bunch of tech firms now say things like, I remember talking to one CEO saying, we saved a lot of money in offices. We're now hiring in like Bulgaria, Mexico, Nigeria, the Philippines, India, etc. So we've accessed this global labor market. But productivity is down, but costs are also down. Hybrid is really different. So hybrid, there's a bunch of papers. I've run some randomized control trials. I mean, I won't go through the details now, but probably the most relevant is we took a 1,600 person firm called Trip.com. They're one of the world's big 3 travel agents. They had 2 whole divisions. They're coders, marketing, accounting, finance, etc. And we randomized them by even and odd birthdays. So if you're even, you had to come in 5 days a week, which is the 2nd, 4th, 6th, 8th of the month, etc. If you're odd, 1st, 3rd, 5th, you got to work from home Wednesday, Friday. So we're basically exactly testing what is hybrid. And there you saw a very small positive effect on productivity, like 2-3%. And the question may be, where does that come from? The reason you get a small positive effect appears to be they get there 3 days a week in the office. They're socializing, mentoring, they're having meetings, etc. The upside of working from home for 2 days a week is, one, you save on time. So the average, these workers actually in China, but in China, as in the US, people are spending more than an hour a day on commute. And it looks like in the US, to give you figures, the average American saves about 70 minutes a day when they work from home, of which 30 minutes they spend more on working and 40 minutes on other things. But if you're an employer, you're getting an extra 30 minutes a day off your employees when they work from home. So that's benefit one. And the other is quiet. So the offices are really noisy. It's really distracting. My favorite evidence on this is actually some of the research from psychology going back decades, whereby they take hundreds of students and they all had to wear headsets and sit this maths test. And half of them had quiet, nothing. And the other half had through their headsets, office noise was piped through it. And they find the folks doing the maths test with the office noise piped through it significantly lower scores. So it's like hard to concentrate. So those are the 2 big benefits. Monday, Friday, save and commute is quieter. So it looks like fully remote is big trade-offs, big positives and negatives. Hybrid is really pretty much a win-win, which is why the entire corporate world is really moving to it. There are flavors, like Disney has just worked from home on Friday, and Amazon and Google are 2-3 days, but pretty much everyone, for managers and professionals, is ending up there.
No, this is super interesting. And I want to kind of like talk a bit more about these two, kind of like the hybrid and the fully remote, right? And so let's start about the hybrid, right? And what we have seen now is some announcement from CEOs that they want to force people back into office like 5 days a week, right? And completely ignore that remote aspect. And we have seen quite of a disconnect in some of your own work. You mentioned that between how some managers see work from home and how employees see work from home. And I think, as we see, overwhelmingly most employees favor work from home, obviously, because especially when you're a caregiver, when you have kids, etc. And the managers often don't share that. And so I'm curious, kind of like when you look at that backdrop, what is the future of work in your perspective? And why do you think we have that disconnect when clearly hybrid work seems to have clear benefits?
So we are kind of in the future now. So one thing, if you look at the data, by, we're now March 2023, work from home numbers and everything's pretty much stabilized. So most organizations, Stanford certainly fits this model, Brookings, I'm sure, pretty much all organizations have all 3 groups. So Stanford has some folks that come in every day, 5 days a week. This will be food service, security, cleaning. Some people are dealing face-to-face, student services, etc. They're not always our employees. So sometimes, cleaning may be outsourced, but, they're on our campus and, many companies are going to have, and that's, again, 50, 60% of the economy. There's a second group, which are like faculty and staff. managers that are hybrid and are just going to remain that way forever. I think this pattern for Stanford is 2 days a week in the office, 3 at home. You mentioned Brookings had some flexibility, but that's a very standard pattern. And then we also have a third group that are fully remote. We have, I think, 1,000 employees now that are not living in California. And that will be much more like IT support, healthcare, payroll. So that is the new normal. And I think how many days you come in really depends on your role. So for most listeners, which is, typically college grads, you're probably going to be coming in. The average person, just to give you numbers, the average person, we survey 10,000 people a month under this thing called SWAY, the Survey of Workplace Attitudes and Arrangements. We've been doing this for like more than 2 years, since the beginning of the pandemic. We ask people, how many days do you want to work from home? And the average is about 2.8, but there's a huge spread. So 30% of people say all the time, I want to be like fully remote.
Yeah.
They tend to be folks in their 30s and 40s with young kids that live far out, so the commute is painful. There's then 20% at the other end that like, never, I want to come in every day. And they tend to be 20-somethings that, want to be social. They want to get mentored, and their apartments are small. So they're like, look, there are 5 of us living in this apartment. Right. I don't want to work from home in my bedroom. There's only one living room. So, and then the other 50% of people are somewhere in the middle. So that gives you this average of about 2.8. If you look under hybrid, most managers want a bit less, but not massively less. Typically managers saying, I want my employees in kind of 3. So there's some gap, but it's not enormous. The gap, if you want to have it, is really on the fully in person. So if you survey the fully in person people, which is the biggest group, they still want to work from home. They're just not able to do it.
Because of the type of job. Oh, that's super interesting. And I think it kind of like shows the nature of the problem, right? Because you have so many diverse opinions. And we've seen the same in the discussions here at Brookings when we were developing our work policy. So let me talk a bit about the fully remote. I'm curious. So what I've seen oftentimes is, I think when you have a fully remote team, right, or a fully remote organization, you will have to probably change your way of how you manage, right? And how you create culture, how you mentor. And I know there are approaches that are quite novel that try to use matching, for example, very senior executives with young people, things like that you have to be more proactive. And so I'm curious, kind of like, have you seen organizations that are doing that very well, where they can still maintain productivity? Because we have seen remote work teams in multinational companies for quite some time, actually, right? Where you have teams that work across the globe and they hand off work. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, and kind of like what new approaches to management such a type of style of setup might need.
Great. So fully remote is quite common. There are about 25 million Americans that are fully remote. To point out, they're mostly not working in entirely fully remote companies. Mostly they are like the IT support folks in a company where some people are coming in. But you're correct, there are some fully remote companies as well. So Automatic, Upwork, Quora, Airbnb, Yelp. I mean, they tend to be in IT. All of them I mentioned are like tech. There are some startups, but it's very much a tech thing. The way they make it work, there's a few things they do. As you say, they're very deliberate about scheduling a lot of repeated Zoom meetings or Teams or whatever it is. They also very focus on writing things down. Turns out to be like Automatic.
Oh, interesting.
Keeping it, or GitHub, a big thing on a very much a written repository. They also still meet in person. The interesting thing is, when I talk to the CEOs of I think all of those companies, and they would still say, look, we still have retreats like every other month. We'll all go to, say, Barcelona if you're in Europe, or maybe Albuquerque or wherever, somewhere nice, and we'll meet for 4 or 5 days, because it's part of building the culture. And these folks will live around the world and they're all flying to place X, or maybe the Europeans will fly into Barcelona and the North Americans into Albuquerque, etc., to meet up, to generate some bonding. The final thing that turns out to matter a lot, and in fact goes back to when I spoke to Marissa Mayer about what happened in Yahoo in 2013 when it was canceled, and temporarily there's a big storm about it, is you need good performance evaluation. So Sanjay, if you're my boss, if I'm in the office, you can kind of see whether I'm working at my computer typing. It's not great. I wouldn't say that, that's kind of 5 out of 10 management watching me, but at least am I there? Am I working? Do I see him? When you walk by, is it on a football match, or am I actually doing something? The problem is when I'm remote, you can't see what I'm doing. So some companies fell back to this really horrible, but I really don't like, surveillance stuff of recording keystrokes and randomly taking screenshots and stuff, which is awful. It's borderline illegal, actually.
Yeah.
But what good companies are doing, and what's being picked up a lot now, is what I call performance evaluation, so output. So you'd say, Nick,
Mm-hmm.
objectives are, I don't know, to teach this number of courses, write this number of papers, deal with policymakers, raise this number of grants. I have like 7 or 8 objectives, and you'd evaluate me against that, use data. Much like when I was back at McKinsey, I had, a grid, and you do that on a regular basis using 360 reviews, etc. That's beneficial for you because you can evaluate me without having to, watch me. It's also much better for me because I'm an employee. I know if I'm working from home on Monday or Friday, I want to go pick my kids up for school or go play a game, game of tennis or go for a run or go to the dentist. I can do it without freaking out that you're going to send me an email and I don't respond in 20 minutes. So as an employer, I want to be evaluated in output and have flexibility. And as an employer, you want that too. So these fully remote companies tend to be also very good at performance managing because that's what you really need for work from home. Even 1+ day a week, you need that to manage people.
That's actually a super interesting point, I think. And I've had kind of like the same experience because we were during the pandemic fully remote. And so what I usually do for our team is I really kind of like focus on output-based metrics, right? Exactly as you say, I don't need to see the people, but I want to see kind of like the output they deliver to me at a certain deadline and then looking at that. So that's really interesting, I think, because that probably requires a shift of thinking among quite a lot of managers from the like, okay, I have the employee sitting in front of me all day long and I can look at them to, okay, what do I want? And kind of like, when do I want it by? And then that employee can, as you say, can send it to me after walking the dog maybe or picking up the kids as long as it fits within the deadline. So that's very interesting.
It's interesting. If you survey people, we ask them, what do you like about, I'll tell you on both sides, we ask you, what do you like about working from home? Number one, it's like really easy to guess. It is, no commute by a landslide. But number two is actually flexibility. And it's exactly your point that if I want to go to the dentist or I want to go for a jog or go pick my kids up or whatever, it's really hard to do it in the office, but at home you can do it. But in order to do that, you need to be output evaluated rather than somebody checking or punching a key every 3 minutes. And then if you ask people, by the way, about what they like about the office, numbers 1 and 2 are like working with colleagues and socializing with colleagues. We ask them, is it the free food or the equipment or being near your manager? No, it's all basically about face-to-face interaction with coworkers.
Yeah, and that's I think also key. Kind of like you probably get different things from how you work, right? And organizations probably have to adapt it to some degree. And so I'm curious, kind of like what other factors should businesses consider when they develop their work from home policies or hybrid policies? I mean, we already talked about the different roles, I think, and the way how you mentor management. Are there other things that they have to be conscious of that you think might be useful?
The 2 ways to think about it is, one is, if you get people into the office, you want to do it on anchor days, at least at the team level, or maybe the group or the area level. So if I'm, working with you and let's say Megan, who helped set this up, if the 3 of us are working together, it's like intensely frustrating. If you're in on Monday, the 2 of us are at home Monday, I'm in on Tuesday, you and Megan are in at home, Megan's in on Wednesday, you and I are, and then like every day we're in, but nobody's here. And we say this is the 2021 experience when people first start to go back. But firms wanted social distancing, so they wanted people to come in on different days. And the stories that came out were like, I come in, there's nobody there, the office is empty, there's no energy. Why have I've wasted my time? I spend all day at Zoom and I commuted. So critical thing 1 is to coordinate. So if you're only going to come in on 1 or 2 days a week, you want to coordinate, and it's basically going to be some combination of Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So anchor days and coordination is pretty critical. People lose choice a bit, but in the surveys, they're prepared to give up some choice. They get some certainty, and also they get the fact that when they come in, everyone else is there. The other thing is, you only need the number of days you really have the amount of in-person interaction. So if most of your job is, individualistic coding, maybe you only need to be in, maybe 1 day a week. If on the other hand, you're in a role like, I don't know, you're designing products with lots of co-workers, a very collaborative thing, and it's a lot of touch and feel and, rapid interaction. You may think that's a 3-4 day a week thing. And so the reason this comes up is there's some companies that tried to drag people in for too many days. And then employees said, well, look, I just don't need that much time in the office. We don't tend to spend a lot of time working together like that. So we have the odd meeting, but it's a waste of time. And so what tends to happen is for firms that have worked well, they've maybe said, look, we're going to have everything on Tuesday, Wednesday. Those are going to be really busy days, kind of meetings, social, trainings, lunches, events, etc. People come in and that happens and they feel like happy. feel like I've come in for a purpose. I have been in meetings. I've hardly been on Zoom all day. That works. I'm happy with it. What doesn't work is saying come in for 4. They come in and most of the day they're on Zoom, and then they're like, why did I come in? And they're kind of frustrated. Then they stop coming in on every day, and then the thing kind of falls apart. So it's better to get 2 days working really well than to push for 4 and have that not working.
I think that's a really key point, because it speaks to purpose, right? Like if you ask people to come back, there should be some purpose to it, because as you say, it's not useful if that person then sits in the office and does Zoom calls all day or codes by themselves. And I think another thing that I hear is really flexibility seems to be key. Flexibility in terms of the roles and the organizations, to some degree at least, right? With these anchor days where you can then work around. So that's super helpful. Another thing that I'm curious about, I think we really are in a very exciting period of the future of work, and so many changes in the labor market, also because of work from home. And so what opportunities do you see when you look at work from home, kind of like opportunities for startups, for entrepreneurs, in terms of getting new talent? You mentioned some companies, for instance, are trying to recruit globally now, which I think is a very big thing, because it really allows companies to source talent in other countries, which previously was not possible because of visa issues or other problems. And then also kind of like opportunities to develop new technology that can kind of like help with collaboration. And I know like a lot of companies are working on metaverse and augmented reality. Like, what are your thoughts on this, and kind of like what the space is in this respect?
Sure. So the first thing that's kind of really exciting about the take up of work from home is it looks like it's been the big driver of this explosion in startups. So
interesting.
We have really good measures of how many new businesses are created in the US from the IRS. So every time you start a new business and you want to employ someone, you have to get what's called an employee identification number, an EIN. You apply to the IRS, you fill out some details, they issue it to you. The IRS has now been counting these and sending the data to the census that publishes that. And so from 2010 onwards, we can see the number of new businesses starting up. It's slowly trending upwards. It's not actually trending up as a share of the economy. It's just there are more people in the US. So it's kind of scaling up with the number of people, but it's a very gradual rise. At the beginning of the pandemic, this thing plummeted. You can imagine like who's going to start a new business in March, April 2020. It then rebounds, which is what you'd expect. There's pent up demand for 3 months of no startups. But then it's fallen, but it stayed really high. So even at the end of 2022, we're still 20% above pre-pandemic. And it looks like we've now just done a higher level of business creation. So there's just massively more businesses being started in a way that honestly was amazing for many economists. And like, it seems really surprising. I get there's a drop and I get there's a rebound. I'd expect it to go back to trend, much like, if you look at eating out or travel or anything else, it's kind of most of it's back on the trend. And I think work from home is a big driver for a few reasons. One is obviously it's cheaper to start a business if you're fully remote, because you don't have to pay for office space. Another fact that maybe not everyone likes, but a lot of people, if they get their job done, I think it's fine. They do other things around it. And it turns out that some of the other things they do is start their own business. If you look at businesses that are founded, often they're founded by someone that has a current job. They're not sure whether the new idea is going to work. They're doing both. Eventually the new business takes off and they quit and they move to that. But that initial early phase. So I think a lot of it's that. I think also a bunch of it is folks in more rural areas or places out of the center of big cities can suddenly now more easily access customers and employees. So all of that is actually very positive for driving growth and driving business creation and dynamism.
That's super interesting. And have you looked at all if there are differences in kind of like work from home policies between startups and incumbent firms in terms of the policies they set internally?
Yeah, so it's definitely the case. Younger firms are much more like to have work from home. So I won't share slides. I can share them around afterwards, but we've been doing some work with the Templeton Foundation. And one of the things we looked at is we ask in every survey, every 10,000 people we survey a month, we ask them, when was your firm founded? And some of those 10,000 people turn out to be owners of businesses themselves. We ask them, when did you found your business? So you can get it either from the employees or from the owners, 2 different ways. Either way, what you see is younger firms, if you look at firm age, as they're young, they tend to have higher rates of work from home, particularly 2019, 2020 onwards. So I think what happened is pandemic begins, everyone's moved to home. If your business is really young, that kind of sticks with you. So younger business tend to be more work from home anyway, because they have less budget and they're more on the side of somebody's regular job. But also there's also a kind of a cohort effect, which is these 2020 onwards cohorts. And that's another reason in the long run, I think work from home may grow. I was actually having lunch with Hayden Brown, who's the CEO of Upwork, and she was saying, you see a lot of these young firms are founded remote. As they grow and become, 10, 20 years from now, big firms, they may still have a pretty remote flavor, or at least, there'll be more remote. They, rather than having people in the office 4 days a week, there may be 2 because they were born into a fully remote setup. And that is one of the things pushing up long run levels of work from home.
That's super interesting, actually. That means that could be a really significant generational cultural shift as these companies mature and become older. That's wonderful. That's really interesting. Another question I had is related kind of a bit to the background of which workers can actually work from home, right? And you have spoken about this, that obviously remote work is largely confined to the well-educated workers, people with a college degree, or at least some college work. And then obviously we have a significant workforce still that have to be there in person, and that are not as well educated, that have to be in person, that cannot do remote work. So what does that mean kind of like for the future of labor markets? Because I think we already see a bifurcation in these labor markets in terms of opportunities, income, etc. Now we have that added on where one part can work from remotely, which is a benefit, and then part of the labor market cannot. What do you see for the future there?
This, again, is a really interesting topic, and I'll just step back a minute to give you kind of the backdrop for where I'm heading, because this is kind of a glass half full, a glass half empty. So in the US, and in fact much of North America and Europe, etc., but particularly in the US data the best, we've seen a big rise in inequality from 1980 to about 2010. So if you look at difference between college grads and non-grads, or the 90th versus 10%, of this is going up and up and up. So inequality is rising to incredibly high levels in 2010. It looks like the growth kind of flattened off around 2010 to 2019, but it certainly wasn't reversing. So inequality got to a very high level in 2010 and kind of stayed at that level. What's been astounding in the pandemic is from 2020 onwards, this has dropped quite a bit. So the inflation over the course of the pandemic, I think, is averaged kind of 6-7% a year. Most graduates have seen pay increases about 4%, which is higher than pre-pandemic, but it's actually less than inflation. So if you look in the US, college grads have actually seen real wage cuts. Whereas if you look at people that left school at high school or less, so, people that think of working frontline, they're working in Chipotle or some, food service, transport, et cetera, frontline essential service workers, et cetera. These folks have actually seen pay increases that are much faster than inflation. So if you go around, going around the local shopping center, and every store has help wanted, and everyone knows it's really hard. And that's meant their wages have risen faster than inflation. In fact, since the pandemic began in 2020, I think the gap between grads and non-grads is closed by about 10%. So it's a massive gap. It's way more than 10%. So inequality kind of went up a lot to 1980 to 2010, went sideways, and is going down a bit now. So that's interesting. Very good news. The interesting thing is why that's happened during the pandemic. And I think work from home is one of the main reasons. So when we survey people, they tell us that work from home, the ability to work from home 2-3 days a week, is worth about the same as a 8 to 10% pay increase. So that's huge. I could ask you, Sanjay. I mean, we were talking before the call. We both do some work from home. I hope no one from Stanford is listening, but it's like I think being able to work from home 2-3 days a week, I could see, would I basically be paid 8% more, but have to go in and sit in the office all day? I don't have a commute, but if you had a commute, a lot of people, and commuting is very unpleasant.
It is, in fact, especially.
Yeah, Danny Kahneman and Richard Ladd, all these people have these surveys from going back 20-30 years, and people, the activity they hate most in the day, more than work, is commuting. They actually prefer to work than commute. So if you take that number, that 8%, that kind of explains why the gap in inequality has fallen. You have a bunch of grads like us that suddenly the work is relatively more appealing than it was in 2019. So labor supply of college grads is up. If you look at labor force participation rates for college graduates in the US, I believe it's above pre-pandemic levels. For non-graduates, it still hasn't recovered. And the reason is they don't have this perk. And in fact, instead they have, there's still some masking, some infection risk. Life is harder and less appealing than it was in 2019 to come into work. And so, interestingly enough, there is a perk from work from home. You're completely correct. It does benefit the already highly paid, but oddly enough, the labor market's kind of adjusted to reverse that in terms of pay. So people that can work from home are getting this nice 8-10% valuation, but have actually relatively got 8 to 10% less pay versus people that can't. And this is
super interesting.
Yeah, it's entirely through changes of labor supply. And it's I'll stop there. But so I don't know whether you see that as good or bad, but it's kind of, you giveth on nice work from home and you taketh away on, salary. So
on the salary side,
some ways are roughly net on where they were versus 2020.
So that's super interesting. That means actually demand and the negotiating power for people maybe that have to be in person has probably gone up because of that also. That's super interesting. Another aspect that also you have written about is what fascinates me about remote work is that it has the potential to really draw in talent from parts of the world and parts of the economy that we might not have been able to draw in otherwise, right? And what you find is that in one study that women and people with children are the ones that often disproportionately benefit from work from home policies. And so can you talk a little bit about that aspect? Because I think this is something that is often really overlooked, right? Like especially when we look at the divide between rural and cities. Cities are super expensive. A lot of the cities where the jobs are in California is a prime example for the San Francisco area, the same with DC. And so there are also oftentimes people that have caregiving responsibilities. They might not be able to move or might not be able to do kind of like the full 9 to 5 with a 2-hour commute, right? So what did you find with that regard? I'm really curious.
Sure. So I think it's a very positive part of work from home. It could increase labor force participation rates, so how many people can and want to work, which again would drive growth, help contain inflation in the long run. So that's really good. It could easily push up. I mean, it's hard to know, but labor force participation rates by 1, 2, 3%. I mean, pretty large numbers actually. That's several millions of Americans that now may work. Yeah. Where does that come from? In the sway, so I have something we're just about to put out with Jose Barrera, Shelby Buckman, and Steve Davis. We interestingly don't see a huge difference on gender on preferences and levels of work from home. So women have a slightly higher preference and actually slightly higher levels of work from home, but the difference isn't huge. What you do see is people with young kids. There's a really quite a large gap there. So both men and women with young children have a much higher preference too, and much higher take-up rate of work from home. Other areas is folks towards the end of their life, people with disabilities, maybe we don't measure it as well, but maybe students. So there's a lot of people that might want to work, say, 20, 30 hours a week. So I think of my parents, they went from kind of going in the commuting every day, a kind of pretty punishing lifestyle of having to go in, commute, work, commute back. And then, that generation, it kind of went from full to nothing. It just stopped because he retired. Yeah. And a lot of that generation say, look, I'd be very happy to work 3 days a week, particularly if 2 are at home. And if the one, they're 7-hour days. So there are folks on that end. There's a bunch of people with, physical disabilities that could easily, be totally, perfectly, actively working. But the thing that's often challenging is the commute. If you allow them to work from home, there's a big increase in labor supply. People with young kids, as you mentioned. I visited a number of work from home workers pre-pandemic, and actually there are often people with either elderly relatives or young children they needed to be at home for. So that I see is really positive. Or students, another group, by the way, students, they often, might want 10 hours or 20 hours a week. Campus may not pay very well. Stanford University and every other university knows it has this captive pool of undergrads wanting to work. So they don't have to pay that much probably. So, if you as a student, you can go and get an online job for 10 hours a week. You can probably get a much better offering. So all of that I think is really good. You also mentioned international. Yes, that's another angle. When I talk to companies, they are often very excited about the potential to have some international employees, some offshoring. Right now, US labor markets are really tight. It's very hard to hire people, call centers, payments processing, HR, this kind of thing. Some of it, as long as the data is not sensitive, I think it's naturally going to be moved to, say, Central and South America, same time zone, or maybe places with good English language skills, the Philippines, India, etc. And I think, again, that's positive for driving growth, for kind of helping push back on inflation.
No, this is very interesting and very fascinating. And another aspect actually that was brought up by one of our audience members relates to kind of like bias, right? Like oftentimes we know in the workplace there are biases, like gender biases, racial biases. We often have sometimes bullying, right? Like and things like that. So how does work from home affect that? Is there a way that this reduces this kind of behavior, that it maybe is more inclusive, can foster a more inclusive workplace? Or could it lead to kind of like a bias against remote workers on the other hand, which some people are worried about? So what does the research say here?
So certainly I've heard lots of people have talked about this, and I'll tell you the two things we have data on, but there's certainly this discussion has come up a lot. I remember really early on in the pandemic, some kind of like founder of a kind of 50-person CEO firm was telling me that she was saying, look, when it was in person, it was always like the same people would speak up. They tended to be loud, confident, often, Native Americans, as in, people that were kind of born and grew up in America. And she said some of the overseas workers felt, they just got shouted down a bit. She said it's on Zoom, it tends to be much more balanced. And she said she was very happy with the bigger mix. I've heard stories in different directions. The two bias things I have seen, one there's lots of evidence on is what's called presenteeism bias. So presenteeism bias is a real thing, and it's definitely worth people being aware of, which is an issue that if there's a team, let's say of 20 people, and 18 of them are coming in 4 or 5 days a week, and 2 of them are working from home, 3-4 days we can only coming in once or twice, they could easily lose out in promotions, they could lose out in training, and they could get forgotten about. To give you an example, I ran a randomized control trial back in 2010 to 2012 on call center workers. And again, we randomized by even and odd birthdays. And I think that time the even one, but they got to work from home 4 days a week, come in 1 day a week, and the odd people came in all 5 days a week. They're all doing the same thing. There's calls dropped into the headsets, they're answering, they're typing stuff in.
Interesting.
We ran the experiment for 9 months, and then we followed them up for another 21 months. We saw that the folks that were randomized to work from home were much happier, they were more productive, their quit rates were down. This is all good. The one bad thing is their promotion rates were almost 50% lower.
Wow, that's huge.
Which is enormous.
Yeah.
Again, we're comparing people who are almost fully remote to people who are coming in full time. So taking kind of pretty extreme outcome. We went to interview the firm and the managers, and they said, well, look, there's 2 things going on. One is maybe there is a bit of, prejudice. We're just forgetting about them. They're out of sight, out of mind. And we're going to work more on this and have training and use data, etc. They said the other problem is harder to deal with, which is some of the stuff you're doing in the office over lunch, over chit chat that may look like wasted time is kind of, connecting to office culture, knowing what's going on. Some of it's even putting yourself forward for promotions.
Interesting.
So one of the pieces of advice I give to companies is try and within teams have the same cadence of coming in. Because what you really don't want is some groups that are at home, some in the office. The demographics tend not to always be the same. You can imagine people that opt to work from home more may not be the same groups that come in, which then generates a horrible issue over, certain demographics get promoted. It's really not a good place to be. So generally, it's as much to try and make sure people come in on, say, 2-3 days, but also to nudge them away from coming in 5 days a week, particularly managers. Because if you're my manager, you come in 5 days a week. I'm in a team of 10. I notice others are coming in. I'm like, wait, I better come in because otherwise I'm going to get left behind. And this work from home policy kind of falls apart. So I've been trying to encourage firms to say, look, if you are going to do 3 days a week, try and stick to 3, but make 3 work, but try not to do 5 and try not to do 1 either. So, maybe if it's 2 or whatever it is, actually you want to kind of encourage people, if possible, to actually, particularly managers, senior managers, to be at home on the home days. Because otherwise, if I'm an employee and my manager's in, I don't feel like I can honestly work from home without losing out.
And then you might have employees that maybe don't have kids at home or something that feel like they have to come in on the same day because they know the boss is in, and then you start having these network effects and social connections. Oh, that's super interesting. I want to move a little bit to kind of like work from anywhere, right? And so my former colleague Raj Chaudhary has done some work in that space. And so you also have written about kind of like when businesses embrace remote work, you might see that like people are moving from kind of like the city centers to the suburbs and rural areas that maybe before might not have been as attractive, but now it's easy for them to do. And so kind of like, do you think that we have seen some of the play out in the last few years where actually people have moved away from metropolitan areas more into like cheaper areas, and kind of like how will cities adapt to that? I mean, I know it's a problem in DC, for instance, where even the mayor now and the federal government, some people are saying like, look, everyone has to come back because our shops are dying. And then the question is like, I don't think the workers' purpose is to maintain the local economy there, right? So there has to be some reimagining of what will be in a downtown. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on this.
I totally agree. So first, I'll just give you some facts from what we've seen. So in another project with Arjun Ramani and Joel Cedio, we've been looking at what's happened to what's called the donut effect. So just to explain, we see from 2020 to now, using US Postal Service data, we know change of address data, that there's been an enormous movement of about 1 million Americans out of big city centers into the suburbs. So you have Washington, DC in your backdrop. I'm lived between San Francisco and San Jose. I was actually up in San Francisco last week for an event in City Hall. So San Francisco, like New York, like DC, has seen a lot of people that are basically hybrid, saying, you know what, if I only have to come into the office 2-3 days a week, I want a bit of space. I can put up with a longer commute. I'll move out to the suburb. So most of these people that left are not going to, rural Wyoming or, Alaska or, Hawaii. They're mostly over, almost 60% are going to the suburbs of the very same cities they came from.
Okay.
And so this is what we call the donut effect, because what it's doing is pushing up property prices and rents in the suburbs and relatively moderating them in the city centers. So I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's in the paper. If you look across America's 12 largest cities, home values actually in the very city centers have risen by less than inflation. It's actually down in real terms since the pandemic.
Wow.
Home values maybe in the center of big cities are up, like apartments maybe 8%, but inflation's 15% over that period. And the inner city, which is the next ring, is also about flat. If you look at the suburbs and the outer suburbs, what we call the exurbs, like more than an hour commute, they're up massively. So the rents and home values are dramatically up because people moved out from the city center to the suburbs. That in many ways is not a bad thing. So if you think about who should be in the city center, if a lot of techies and bankers move out to the suburbs because they can, essential service workers, people that work in retail, police, nurses, etc., that need to be in work every day in the city center, it makes more sense for them to be in. And so if relatively city center accommodation has become a bit cheaper, that's a good thing. So that's one trend that's gone on. I think it's here to stay. Rush, you mentioned Rush Chowdhury's done some fantastic work. He's looked at also going fully remote. That's another trend we see. The numbers of people going fully remote aren't quite as big, but they have a large impact on some areas. So we think of really nice holiday resort type places, like kind of Tahoe, which I know, which is, probably nice beach resorts, probably, Martha's Vineyard and places like that. They've seen a flooding of people from, city centers out to these areas that are now gone fully remote and pushing up prices as well. So lower income rural areas have not seen that much movement out, but some rural areas have seen a lot of movement out from, techies that are now working fully remotely.
That's actually interesting. And I think that might actually be a chance to revitalize some of those areas that really have lost out on some of these new knowledge jobs, right? Because if you have the right infrastructure in place, high-speed internet, you could attract some of those workers and revitalize communities that would be otherwise not in good shape.
Yeah, so there's a nice piece. I think it was maybe in the Times or the Journal, I can't remember, about places like, in Missouri or Columbus, Ohio, or, I can't remember the exact, they picked on a few cities, Toledo maybe, they're saying these are cities that aren't fearsomely expensive, have good connectivity. There's some good schools there. There isn't, the crime is kind of under control, and they're actually really appealing. If you get a job that's fully remote, you can actually move out there and have a much better quality of life than, say, if you're in central San Francisco or New York, where it's really expensive. And so some of these places, their proposition has been, come out to place X, even if you're only in the office one day a week, you can come in or commute from, Columbus, Ohio into New York once a week or something. So yes, I think it's less the really rural areas that are benefiting. It is more towns, ranked 50 to 200 or cities in America that are seeming to benefit.
That's interesting. And I do think it poses a lot of challenges for city planners in the big metropolitan areas, right? And for mayors, et cetera, to try to reimagine what to do with downtown areas where you might not need as much office space as you historically needed, right? And I think, have you seen any novel thinking in that area? Because I've not seen too much novel thinking. I've seen a lot of kind of like, let's try to get people back, rather than thinking, how can we reimagine how the city looks like and works?
Yeah, the event last week in San Francisco, some of the numbers are pretty shocking, actually. San Francisco, by the way, very similar to New York, probably DC, San Jose, Seattle. So pre-pandemic office vacancy rates were about 10%. So it just any one given point of time, 10% of office space is vacant, which was the normal. Apparently, during the height of the dot-com crash, that went up to about 20%. So that's a very high level. That was the previous high watermark. Currently, it's about 30 and rising to reach potentially 40. And the more shocking thing is the forecasts were it may not get back down to 10, 15% until about 2033. So we're looking.
That's crazy.
I know. I was like, that's a decade of empty office space. You're like, why can't it adjust faster? The reason is 95% of this office space can't be converted to residential. So if you have a small office, what I call a European office, like when I was back in London, it's small, it only has, 2-3 rooms per floor. It's some quaint old building. That stuff you can knock through and convert just about. It's expensive, but it's possible. If you think of massive skyscrapers, they don't have enough windows and they don't have enough bathrooms. Because if you think of your house, very few houses have rooms without windows. And every house has, multiple bathrooms. So it's nowhere near enough in skyscrapers. Turns out it's just incredibly expensive to convert this. So you're now looking at a situation where there's a lot of this office space that's now empty. Actually, a lot of the retail space is empty too. Because if you think of Starbucks and Au Bon Pain and Pret, etc., they rely on the office workers, so they're not there. And it's hard to repurpose it. It's actually genuinely really tough. And I agree with you that I think governors saying people need to come back in to revitalize our city center doesn't make a lot of sense because they're currently spending the money just out in the suburbs and it's going to Hey, Paul, why would you take business away from the suburbs and move it back to the center? I think there is some creative thinking needed. It's a hard problem. I mean, one of the things is ideally is getting people living back in city centers. So to address what was the affordability crisis, zoning, it's not easy actually. A lot of these office buildings are hard to reconvert. I mean, the main thing is to not build any more. The last thing you want is any more buildings.
That's true.
And over time, slowly convert these guys or find other uses for them, turn them into, gyms. I mean, it's going to have to be some creative use of them.
No, I totally agree. We actually got an interesting question from one of the audience members live. And so they asked, when you see productivity declines or there's a small positive effect, how are you defining productivity and what kind of data are you looking at for that? It's an interesting question.
It's a great question. So we had 4 different measures. So one measure was in the company I mentioned, Trip.com, they have a very rigorous performance review process. It happens every 6 months. Managers give feedback, employees write what they think, they go out to other people, they collate, they come up with a performance review. It's a 5-point scale. That performance review wasn't changed at the end of the 6-month experiment. And in fact, we ran it another 6 months later, we're about to get further 6 months out. Promotion rates, which is maybe a slightly harder data, so they have a minor promotion, which is a pay increase, a major promotion, change of role. That was unchanged. There's also lines of code written in product shipped for the coders. There are about 600 of them out of the 1,600. Lines of code is not a great measure, but in product shipped is a lot better because if I write 200 lines of rubbishy code, it doesn't go out. If I write 5 lines of good code, it goes out. That was up about 5%. Okay. And then the final question was self-assessed productivity. Interesting enough, at the beginning of the experiment, the average self-assessed productivity of work from home is about 0, with managers claiming it's about -2% and employees about +1%. So managers were like, really bad. Employees were positive. At the end of it, the average went from 0 to about +2%, with managers now positive and employees even more positive. So it looks like experience, I've seen this in other studies, experience and exposure to work from home, if it's moderate, tends to lead people to think it's mildly positive for productivity. But there are a number of hanging questions over this. We're on Zoom. I was speaking to Eric Yuan about, in the long run, if we're remote, does it damage long run creativity and innovation? More of our measures tend to be short run. So all the stuff I've seen is probably if you're getting people into the office 3 days a week, say for hybrid, and they're focused, they're meeting together, they're working together, that's probably pretty good. In fact, the evidence from psychologists is to be creative, you need some quiet time to think. So, having a quiet Friday is good for thinking as well as problem-solving meetings on a Thursday. I think if you're fully remote, it's not that you can't be creative, but I think it's generally harder. And in fact, if you're fully in the office, it may actually be harder because it's so hectic and busy, you don't get any quiet time.
You don't get the time to think and actually like stew over what you want to do, right?
There's always someone hovering on, running in, and disrupting you.
And you see, I mean, professions where you need a lot of thinking, like faculty members, right? Like they oftentimes take that time in between to think about new research before writing a new piece and have that downtime. So another thing is obviously like here in DC, we're very kind of like concerned about what policymakers can do and what's the interaction with policymakers and trends in the marketplace. And so when looking at work from home, right, I mean, one thing obviously that policymakers can do is try to expand broadband access to areas that maybe not have it right now, or like have very like spotty coverage. What are some other measures policymakers might consider to accommodate a US remote workforce or work from home? Because I think one challenge that I've observed is oftentimes a problem with like having fully remote teams or fully remote positions is labor laws, right? You have all these different labor laws and tax laws in different states. Organizations that maybe have never done that before are not set up to deal with that. And so what are kind of like the policy measures that could help transition us to a more flexible economy where we can accommodate these different work arrangements that we discussed today?
Great. So yeah, three thoughts. The first two completely overlap with what you had, Sanjay, which is one is, broadband availability and also pricing. So some of the issue, I think this is work from Brookings, that broadband, sometimes available is incredibly expensive because of, monopolistic supply. So that's one for sure. That's facilitation. You're totally correct on tax and legal issues. I've talked to many employers that have said it's kind of like a nightmare. Like, we're based in Connecticut and we let employees, be fully remote, or some employees, and now they move to other states and are supposed to file returns in that state. Some have told me, confidentially, that would rather they told us they're in Connecticut, even if they're not, because at least we'd have to deal with it.
Right.
I suspect they're not, but please don't tell me. It's like a horrible situation to be in. So for Californian firms, I mean, as soon as you cross the border to Nevada or Oregon, you have different legislation. So that is a big thing, and trying to harmonize, and also trying to figure out how you deal with remote workers. If I'm 4 days a week in Nevada, come into California 1 day a week, do as a firm, I now have a substantial presence in Nevada. Should I be paying corporate income tax in Nevada? There's a lot of stuff that's actually quite painful. And then I think the final thing is actually generally for politicians just to stay out. I think it's in the US. In Europe, there's a lot of regulation that's being debated about forcing people to work from home and forcing companies to do it. Mostly when I talk to companies, pretty much always, they go for hybrid because it makes them money. So, companies, it's not part of a social movement. They're saying, look, employees really like it. So it's really helpful retention recruitment, saving us hundreds of thousands of dollars, per team per year of that industry retraining, and millions hiring people. Also seems to help productivity a little bit. Also maybe saves a bit of space, can at the margins but also be helpful for DEI. So companies are adopting it as a big driver of profit. So generally, the government forcing it is not useful. In the US, the two problems I've seen has been, on the right, there are some of the kind of very populist Republican governors like Youngkin that have said they want all the office workers back 5 days a week, because it's kind of the politics of envy. If you look at who's voting for those politicians, they tend to be people that can't work from home. It's a perk they've not got. They feel envious. I kind of get it, but maybe it makes good politics. It makes bad policy. I mean, you're basically, for federal government workers, forcing them back in 5 days a week makes no sense, and it makes it much harder to recruit and retain good employees, so eventually damage public services. The other extreme for the Democrat mayors in cities like San Francisco, Washington, New York, I understand why they want people back in, but it's not really in the national interest particularly. So it really, if London Breed gets more activity in the center of San Francisco, I can totally understand where she's coming from, because it's her tax and her economic activity, but it's taking it out of Oakland, it's taking it out of South Bay, taking it out of other areas. Same with DC. So I can see mayors will lobby. I get it. They lobby for what's in their own self-interest, but the federal government should not be involved in shifting people around. I mean, there's no reason why suburban DC is more or less deserving than central DC of economic activity.
That's true. I think that's a really great point. It's kind of like that interference, I think, could be more harmful actually in the market. So that's super helpful. And you mentioned Europe, that I've seen that too, that kind of like proposals for legislation to make like remote work a new workers' right? And have you seen anything in that, like any movements from unions or even the US kind of like seeing it as a new benefit or a new right that workers should have legally?
So, firstly, it's definitely a benefit. So I'll tell you, now when you talk to employers, there's healthcare, pension, and work from home. Those are like,
okay, that's big.
So I remember talking to some recruiter, and she said, look, this was in tech, forget it if you're going to force people back in the office 5 days a week. I'm not even going to take that case. They're unrecruitable at this point. So
that's interesting.
And firms are doing, firms are responding. This is why hybrid has become totally dominant. And this 45 about 40% of Americans work from home 1+ day a week. And, there's a reason, because it's in firms' interest to do it. Whether you want to regulate, I don't see why you'd want to. It's a bit like having a regulation that I'm going to force firms to make profit. It's kind of like a weird regulate. Like, why do you force them to? And of course, then you just blow them up, and it's like red tape and have to tick boxes. And the Europeans, maybe, in my experience of having talked to a lot of European countries, and in fact collected a lot of data in Europe, is work from home is also pretty common in Europe, hybrid. So it's not clear. This, government should be regulating and other things like obviously pollution and matching labor laws and not laying people off with no warning at all, and healthcare, etc. But this is an area where typically it's an employer's interest. They basically get it when I talk to them, and there doesn't seem to be a real problem with forcing people. I mean, there are a few exceptions. So there's Elon Musk, but even Elon Musk has changed his mind. I don't know if you noticed, but
I haven't heard that.
Well, he's closing down the Seattle in one of their office and telling people to go fully remote. So,
wow, that is quite a change from like 2 months ago.
Yeah, and apparently people are still not going into Twitter every day. So, because I don't know if again, this was 2-3 months ago, but he said people had to come back, and then 2 days later he changed his mind because apparently it's about mass resignation. So employers get it. I mean, if you try and force people back in, coming back to the 8% number I mentioned, currently the employment cost index is about 6%, rising 6% a year. So if you're an employer, just to tread water, you've got to be putting up salaries by 6%. If you then say, I want you all back 5 days a week, you've got to add about another 8% to that to compensate for this loss of this valuable perk. So now you're like putting up salaries 14%, and nobody has the money to do that. So this is not happening.
This is super helpful. And I think kind of like where the role of government could really be here is maybe to facilitate, as you say, kind of like some of these complex labor and tax challenges, to make those easier, right? Because I think this is really where this stands in the way of a future of work where this flexibility and this new work model can work better, right, across state lines within the same country.
Exactly right.
No, this has been really wonderful. We're at the end of our time, but I really appreciate your time. I know you're super busy and in very high demand. So thank you so much for being here today and for this wonderful discussion.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sanjay. It was great. Thank you very much for the questions and for being interested. I was saying before the call, I've been working on this for 20 years, and no one really cared that much about work from home. And then suddenly in March 2020, it's kind of, who knows where this will be 3 years from now, but certainly the last 2-3 years, there's been a lot of interest in this as a topic.
Must have been a good roller coaster ride for you.
It has. You just like I talked to someone as an epidemiologist, they said, no one paid much attention to their work, and suddenly
that's true.
This is for a better reason, actually. This is a nice reason that people are the work. Well, the pandemic is obviously terrible, but the work from home itself is generally seen as a pretty positive thing for society. That's true. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Okay. I really appreciate it. Take care.